So far, we've examined wealth at the global level, and we've seen that the distribution of global wealth is highly uneven, with the US, Japan, and the European Union possessing the lion's share of global wealth, while the entire continent of Africa, the rest of Asia, and all of Latin America claim only a small portion of the global wealth. In the process, we saw data that showed the effects of colonialism, slavery, and the stealing of land from Native Americans, all of which resulted in a sharp economic divide between what Du Bois identified as the core and periphery nations. What we couldn't see in the tables we looked at so far is how wealth is distributed within a given country. And when you examine that data, you find there's far more economic inequality than was evident at the global level. This is what we're going to focus on now. But first, we need to start by distinguishing between three classes: lower, middle, and upper class. Piketty's convention was to try to define the middle class in a way that lines up with our popular conception of what a middle class lifestyle looks like. So this is how he breaks it down. The upper class represents the top 10% of the country in terms of wealth and income. The middle class represents the next 40% of the population, while the lower class includes the bottom 50% of the population. So the distribution looks like this. Notice this means that the bottom of the middle class is at the average of society, and the rest of the middle class is actually above the average. Again, this is because when we talk about the middle class, we're typically referring to people who are actually doing pretty well. In fact, better than the bulk of the population, though they're still a long way from the true elite of society. Piketty further divides the upper class, the top 10%, into what he calls the dominant class, who represent the top 1% of the population, followed by the well-to-do class, who represent the next 9% of the population. So now the distribution looks like this. Note the tiny sliver at the top. That's the dominant class, the top 1%. Okay, with this separation of various classes in mind, we can now examine how capital is distributed in the United States, and we can see how that compares to Europe in different time periods. So why don't you turn to table 7.2 in your handout. The numbers for the US are from 2010. At that time, the upper class, the top 10%, owned 70% of all the capital in this country. The dominant class, again the top 1%, owned about half of that, 35% of the nation's wealth. The middle class owned 25% of the capital in this country, and the lower class owned only 5%. When you draw global comparisons, this means that the US is considered to be highly unequal in terms of the distribution of capital wealth. You can see how this distribution compares with Europe during the same year, a region that may be considered to have a medium-high level of inequality, and with Scandinavia during the 1970s and 80s, which represents a medium degree of inequality. Still, the distribution of wealth in the US is not as bad as it was in Europe in 1910, at the end of the Gilded Age, and before the shocks of the two world wars and the Great Depression, which can be considered an example of very high inequality. On the other hand, we're still a long way from a low degree of inequality, which doesn't actually exist anywhere. Why don't you take a moment and pause the video to compare the income distributions from one column to the next. Now let's take a moment to focus in on this middle class category. If you look at Europe in 1910, the middle class owned only 5% of the total capital wealth, which was no different than the lower class. If you compare this across the board, the middle class owns significantly more of the capital wealth today than in Europe in 1910. In Scandinavian countries in the 70s and 80s, they owned 40% of the nation's capital. In Europe today, they own 35%. And even in the US, which is considered to be highly unequal, the middle class owns 25%. What this tells us is that the shocks that occurred after the Gilded Age ended in 1910, the two world wars and the Great Depression, and all the policy changes that were implemented in order to recover from these shocks, that opened the door for what Piketty considers the principal structural transformation in the distribution of wealth in the 20th century, and that is the emergence of a propertied middle class. Essentially, there was no propertied middle class prior to 1910 because those in the middle were almost as poor as the lower class. So the emergence of this middle class was an unprecedented historical innovation. Moreover, it has deeply altered the social landscape and political structure of society. Think about how often politicians have to pander to the middle class, and the rhetoric surrounding most policies is shaped by attempting to appeal to the middle class. Even so, the emergence of the middle class is fragile and even reversible. As we saw in the US, the middle class only owns 25% of the total wealth, even though they represent 40% of the population. Of course, the lower class is left almost entirely out of the equation with only 5% of the total wealth. In fact, inequality is actually growing, which means that the middle class is at risk of disappearing again as the US increasingly begins to look like the aristocratic Europe of 1910, where they owned only 5% of the total capital.